My name is Cecelia Paine. I was born in Bloomington, Illinois in 1950. I was one of six children, and my mother was quite well educated, and my father was very supportive of education. So we were encouraged to be able to take care of ourselves. And so all of us went into fields where there was an end in sight. We became professionals, or we became focused in a way that we could fend for ourselves. We could look after ourselves, and I became interested in design very early in my life. I started out wanting to be a draftsman because that was the only thing I knew about. But then as I became more mature, I became interested in architecture, and I was always interested in landscape architecture as well. I knew about it because my mother subscribed to House and Home magazine, and I became aware of landscape architects through that. I actually started university as an architect, and I was competing with children of architects from Chicago. And Chicago, as you know, is the center of architecture in the US, or it was at the time. And so I was studying with young men who were oftentimes the children of very famous architects, and I felt very out of place. And I looked then into the study of landscape architecture, and I always felt very at home from the very beginning in what landscape architecture was focused on and the people that were involved in the program at the university where I studied. So it was a mix of things that drew me to landscape architecture. My studies in landscape architecture began at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. I started in architecture, but I transferred fairly quickly into landscape architecture. I graduated from that program in 1972. I started work then soon after, and I worked for 5 years as a professional landscape architect. And then I decided to go back to graduate school, and I decided to go to the University of Michigan. I was offered a significant fellowship there. That was one of the major reasons I decided to go to that university. I graduated from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor in 1980. When I graduated from the University of Illinois, I was awarded the most significant prize that was offered, which was the Edward L. Ryerson Traveling Fellowship. And actually that was an incentive for me to transfer into the landscape architecture program because I thought that having a chance to travel as a young professional would be a great opportunity. So that gave me, at that time, $3,500 to travel. The only requirement of the fellowship was you had to travel outside of the United States, and you had to be gone for 6 months. And so my sister and I headed off to Europe in 1973, and we did the grand European tour that all young people do. And it was an opportunity that changed my life. It was because of that award that I came to Canada. I met a lot of young Canadians when I was traveling. I got interested in being outside of the United States, and it actually was probably the single biggest influence in my life. My first professional job was in 1972 as a landscape architect for the firm Harlan Bartholomew and Associates. It was not a well-known firm outside of the United States. It was known as a multidisciplinary firm. It was one of the first firms in the United States to have a range of disciplines. It was started as a planning and landscape architecture firm, but it also included civil engineering, traffic engineering, and probably other fields as well. They were very interested in the integration of those firms. We worked collaboratively. A lot of what I did was parks planning at a municipal scale. We served as the consultants to small suburban communities in the Chicago area, suburban communities that didn't have the resources to hire their own planners in-house. So we served as the planners for those communities, but also as the landscape architect approval group. So site plans that needed to be approved in those municipalities would often be given to us to review, just as site planners in the municipalities do today here in Canada. In 1974, I immigrated to Ottawa, and the reason I went there was that a colleague of mine from the University of Illinois had gone to Canada, and he called me up one day and said, "How would you like to come to Canada to work for a terrific firm?" And that firm was D.W. Graham and Associates. Don Graham was a very significant landscape architect in the Ottawa area, had a very large firm at the time. He had 17 landscape architects working for him when I came there. And I worked for him for a number of years and then returned to graduate school. And after that, worked for the National Capital Commission in-house for a couple of years, and then eventually started my own firm. My firm in Ottawa was well known for the work that we did for the City of Ottawa and for the National Capital Commission. I worked in Ottawa for a total of 16 years. I came there in 1974, I left in 1990. The last 10 years, I had a firm, Cecelia Paine and Associates. And in that time, I became very well known for working on reasonably large projects, but many times they were large projects, and my firm was actually very small, but I would collaborate with other specialists, and we were fairly successful. We were successful in getting very interesting work. The two projects I'll mention are first Spark Street Mall, which was a very urban project. The other project that I would like to talk about is Mackenzie King Estate. I actually started working on the restoration of the grounds of Mackenzie King Estate in 1984, and that carried on for a number of years, and I was called back from Guelph, where I was teaching, to come back and do additional work there in some 25 years later. I was very pleased in 1993 to be selected as a fellow of the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects. That was something that I had set as a potential goal, that I would love to be selected to be a fellow of the CSLA at some point in my career. Other achievements that I'm proud of and that I think are worth mentioning are the contributions I made to establishing the Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation. I was involved with, in fact, I was chair of a task force. I worked with Don Graham originally, and Don Graham, who had actually instituted the foundation, I helped to then revitalize it, and I chaired a task force that developed a mechanism by which we would develop a board of directors and begin to generate a means of receiving donations and making awards for significant projects that we thought would not only better landscape architecture and advance the profession, but would advance an understanding of Canadian landscapes, built and natural landscapes, and to support activities and initiatives that would bring an understanding of the importance of landscape in people's lives. The foundation was originally founded by Don in the 1970s. The revitalization of it, if you want to call it that, happened in the 1980s, the late 1980s. And we gave out our first grant in 1988. And we're now close to reaching $750,000 in investments, in assets in the foundation. And from that, we are then able to give scholarships and awards to people for their research and their initiatives. The other achievement that I would like to talk about is chairing the task force to initiate a new professional magazine for the Canadian Society of Landscape Architects. In the past, we had had journals, but they were owned by individuals. And my idea was that the magazine should be owned by the CSLA. It should be owned by the profession itself. I was 40 when I began my career in Guelph as an associate professor. I had an expertise in heritage conservation, which was a specialization that was evolving in the field of landscape architecture. I had done my master's thesis at the University of Michigan, specializing in heritage landscape conservation, and that fit very well in the context of the University of Guelph and added to the specializations and the expertise of the faculty. I was lucky to work with not only wonderful colleagues, but the University of Guelph has excellent students going into the program. And so over my period of 28 years that I've been there, I've had the fortune to instruct design studios, primarily teaching in design studios at both the graduate and undergraduate level, primarily in open space planning and design and in community design, teaching students about building neighborhoods, designing neighborhoods. The other area that I teach in at the University of Guelph is in professional practice. Because I came from a professional practice background, I also taught courses primarily at the undergraduate level. As a faculty member at the University of Guelph, I became the graduate coordinator in the program, which meant I was responsible for managing the Master of Landscape Architecture program, and I got to know a number of the senior administrators when I was serving in that role. In 2006, I was selected by the Dean of Graduate Studies to be the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies at the university. So for the next 8 years, from 2006 to 2014, I served as Associate Dean of Graduate Studies, which meant that I was working with the departments across the university and primarily with graduate students across the university. It was a wonderful opportunity to understand the breadth of the university and the issues that graduate students were dealing with. There are a number of women that I'd like to mention who influenced me over the course of my career. First of all, I'd like to mention my mother, who was a professional in her own right. She wasn't a design professional, but she was a strong influence in pushing me to be a good student, to go on to university, to achieve the most that I could. My mother had a friend who befriended me and encouraged me in my career. I also had, in completing my degree at the University of Illinois, a woman named Natalie Alpert, who was not an instructor, but she had been brought in to basically be a role model for women. She had graduated from the master's program and was a mature woman. She was in her 50s when she graduated. And she then was asked to teach and assist the faculty so that there would be more female presence in the program. I was among the few women in the program, and they wanted to have more role models for the young women in the program. And then later in my work at the University of Guelph, Isabel Heathcote was the Dean of Graduate Studies who selected me to be the Associate Dean. And she was really the first female boss that I had ever had in my career. And by that time, I was 56 years old. And Isabel was a very inspiring individual. She was a biologist, but she also had an engineering qualification and just was a brilliant woman. And I learned so much from her about dealing with people from all walks of life, from all the disciplines that we had at the university. Another influence was Cornelia Oberlander. I knew that they were going to award the contract for the National Gallery of Canada to someone, to an architect, and I heard that it had been given to Moshe Safdie. So I called up Safdie's office. He had an Ottawa office at that time, and I asked who the landscape architect was that was going to be working with him. And he said, oh, it's Cornelia Oberlander. And so I quickly called Cornelia Oberlander and asked her if I might be able to assist her in any of the work that she needed help with in Ottawa. And she told me over the phone that she did not know that she had been selected. So I was actually the first one to tell her that she had gotten this commission. And she then said, oh, well, I would very much like to have a local presence and somebody that could help me source materials and do other work of that nature. And so that started out a relationship that Cornelia and I had for a number of years working on the National Gallery of Canada. If I was going to give advice to young landscape architects, and this is the advice I give to the young landscape architects because as an educator, I'm often in that position of working with students as an advisor, as a professional advisor through the OALA, or students get in touch with me about how to advance their careers. And my one piece of standard advice is to stay with the profession. The profession sometimes doesn't become all you want it to be, all you imagined it to be in the first few years after you've graduated, after you've started your professional life. It sometimes takes many years for it to really blossom, for you to be able to become what you feel is a successful landscape architect. So my advice is to stay with the profession. It is something that grows, that you learn, that you can actually develop it as you want it to be. It doesn't necessarily have to be as you saw it as a young student. You can make the profession into something that actually fits your personality and fits what you would like it to be. I look at European countries, especially, we look at Sweden, we look at Finland, Norway, Denmark, Holland, and we see this culture of design. We see an appreciation of whether it's architecture, landscape architecture, fashion design, industrial design. There's a culture of design. Italy is the same, and Spain is similar. I would like to see more awareness and maybe starting at a very young age with children, helping them to understand nature and its influence on design, helping them to understand our heritage, but also understanding the importance of how we think about design and how that can make a better environment for people to live in, a healthier environment for people to live in.